Hey guys, it's Brother Ray Jones with the First Church of God in Princeton, West Virginia. I want to welcome you to our midweek Bible study. I want to thank you for tuning in tonight and for being a part of this time of learning and growing together in the spiritual life. I am thrilled and honored that you are giving some of your time to share with me tonight for this particular venture, and I hope you receive a blessing from it. As folks are tuning in, I just want to remind you that we would love for you to participate in this tonight. You feel free to make comments. If you're watching this on Facebook, you feel free to use those emoji buttons. We would love for you to interact with us as we do this time of learning and growing together. We're going to be looking tonight at another lesson that we can learn from the life of Moses. And tonight we want to talk about, even though we're in the desert, we're not deserted. We're going to be looking in Exodus, the 3rd chapter, just at one verse there. And then we'll also be looking in Deuteronomy tonight as well. So if you want to go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 3, and then we'll be referencing in Deuteronomy as well. So I want you to think with me tonight about a movie that came out first in 1984. Then there was a remake in 2010. The name of the movie was The Karate Kid. And I remember watching both of them, but particularly the original when I was a young man then, going to the theater, seeing The Karate Kid. It was a really, really cool movie. The Karate Kid wanted to learn martial arts. And if you've seen that movie, you know that when he goes and begins learning martial arts, his first lesson involved washing and waxing cars. The kid reluctantly obeyed his teacher, but he reached a point where he was fed up with car cleaning and ready to quit. And as he was about to walk off, his instructor turned him around and began throwing punches at him while yelling, "Wax on and wax off." And remember, if you go back and watch that movie, he was to wax on a certain way and he was to wax off in the other direction. And when his instructor began throwing those punches at him, he would holler, "Wax on, wax off." And automatically the kid starts doing this, and he notices that he's blocking punches. So what the Karate Kid thought he was doing as a menial task of washing and waxing or cleaning vehicles was actually teaching him karate. He just didn't realize it at the time. Excuse me, sometimes we are learning lessons through some of the most mundane things in life. And Moses found this out. He had some important lessons to learn. He had failed miserably by taking matters into his own hands and killing an Egyptian taskmaster. When Pharaoh learned what had happened, he put a bounty out on Moses' head, and Moses fled from Egypt, and he ended up stopping in Midian by a well. And at that well, Moses encountered some shepherdesses, and he intervened with some of the shepherds, started giving the ladies a hard time, and went so far as to water their sheep for them. And this earned him an invitation to supper, which led to a job offer, which led to Moses finding a wife, which led to him and his wife having some children. Okay? So Moses went from luxurious living in an Egyptian palace to the wilderness, to the backside of the desert in a land of Midian. In Exodus 3:1, we read these words. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Imagine this with me tonight. Here is Moses' opportunity to go from leading a lot of people and being groomed, we believe, to become the next Pharaoh, to now leading a bunch of sheep. I want us to think tonight and understand God often uses desert experiences to train his people for great works. Moses is not alone in this training program. If you read further ahead in the scripture, you read about a guy named David. He was Jesse's youngest son, and he was to become king of Israel. He was God's chosen person to replace King Saul. And when Samuel showed up to anoint this new king of Israel, Samuel didn't know who it was at the time. God had just told him, you need to go to Jesse's house and you need to look at all his boys, and I'll show you which one it's going to be. Well, they didn't even bring David to that little party because he was the youngest and he was busy taking care of business. And after Samuel saw all of Jesse's older sons, and God kept saying, no, 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 it's not this one, not this one, not this one, not this one. He got to the very last one who was present at the time. He looked at Jesse, he said, you got any more sons? He said, well, it's just, little David out there taking care of the sheep, but surely the Lord doesn't want him to be king. Samuel said, send for him, and here comes David, and God says, that's the one right there. God prepared David to do great things by putting him out tending sheep. And he's doing the same thing with Moses. But there are a lot of desert places that God can take us to prepare us and train us for what he wants us to do. Sometimes that desert place is actually a faraway place where you end up in some isolation for a time. At other times, it could be in a crowded place. It's possible to be alone in a crowd, and maybe you're a student or you've been a student in a crowded school, but you felt all alone because you transferred in and you really didn't know anybody. Maybe you have experienced a prolonged illness. Sometimes when we're hospitalized or homebound, and even heaven forbid, having to be in a nursing home or a rehab facility, during those times, those are sort of desert places that God can use to get us alone and to train us in some things. I have had relatively good health for the overwhelming majority of my life. But in about November of last year, I tested positive for COVID, had to stay home for a couple of weeks, and I was well taken care of, don't get me wrong, but that was kind of a deserted place. You're just there by yourself, and while people checked on me, and I was grateful for that couple of weeks, it was really different. I can identify with a little bit of that. Maybe you've been the caregiver of someone who has had a prolonged illness. That can be one of those desert places. While you get up and just do some of the most mundane things, some of the most simple things for someone else that they can no longer do for themselves. That is a loving thing to do, but it's also a tedious thing to do. And it becomes your life during those times. And in those places, sometimes God shows up and he's training us for something in those desert places. When we have the loss of a friend or a loved one to death, we can find ourselves in some of those desert places where we feel all alone, where we feel far from everybody and far from all that's going on. Maybe there could be another kind of loss, a loss of a relationship due to other means. Maybe it was a divorce or a layoff, or you got fired from a job. Those can be experiences that take us to some of these desert places in life. But these desert places are places where God often shows up and does some of his great work. Now, we can end up in some of these deserts for various reasons. Sometimes we've done something wrong ourselves. That was Moses' situation. He ended up in the desert because he killed someone wrongfully, and he had to flee for his life. Moses ended up in his desert place because of his own dumb fault, so to speak. All right? Sometimes we end up in desert places because of the mistakes of others. If you read on ahead in the Old Testament, you'll read of a time where after the Hebrew children have been set free and they're on the way to the promised land, Moses sends out some spies to go check out that promised land, and 10 of them come back and give a bad report. 2 of them give a good report and say, hey, we can really do this. We can take the land. And the majority of the people believe the majority of the spies who were sent out. And they end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. We're going to learn more about that as we get further into the study of the life of Moses. But basically, all of the people, and particularly the 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who had faith and were trusting God and wanted everybody else to move forward, they ended up in a desert place because of the lack of faith of other people. Sometimes we're in the desert because of our own mistakes. Sometimes it's because of the mistakes of others. And quite honestly, there are times when we end up in a desert place by the leading of the Lord. When we read of Jesus' life, we find out that there was a point in his life where he was led in the wilderness by the Spirit to be tempted by the devil. Purposely and methodically and for very important reasons, the Spirit of God led the Son of God into that place. So these desert places that we find ourselves in, we can get there through various means. And don't forget, while it may be hard for us to wrap our minds around, God sometimes does indeed lead us to those desert places. But here are some things when we're in those desert places that we know we're going to face. One of those things is obscurity. Now think about Moses' situation. He went from being the big man on campus to being the low man on the totem pole. He used to be in Egypt, and he was revered as one of Pharaoh's sons. Now he's running for his life, and he's a fugitive. He went from giving orders to men who saluted him to leading sheep who ignore him. He also is learning what it's like to lead a wife and children at this point in his life. So Moses went into his desert place and he became obscure. He didn't see his name in bright lights, so to speak, or in fancy places. He didn't have any notoriety there. He was just another guy. He was in obscurity. Another thing that we face in our desert places is that place of that thing of time. When we are in our desert, we're not only in obscurity, but we find out time kind of stands still. Your world will all but stop turning when you're in the desert, while everybody else's keeps going. And by the way, we know that Moses ended up having 40 years of his life in the desert. I want you to think about this with me for a moment. I remember I pastored a guy who had a lot of health issues. He ended up in the hospital, and I went to visit with him. And one of the things that he told me was simply this. You know, everybody else's world is still turning, but mine has stood still. Everybody else is blowing and going. They're going to work. They're living their life. They're going here. They're going there. And I'm laying in this bed, and I'm struggling. Well, my friends, that's the way it feels. And for us, when we're in that desert place, particularly when we're sick, we don't often even know what day it is or what time it is. I can remember from my 2 weeks of quarantining and dealing with COVID, that was some interesting time. There was no place to go, nothing to do. And just sitting there, maybe watching some TV and some other things like that and resting and trying to recuperate. But everybody else is going on about, you know, you could look on social media, everybody's going here and going there, and you got no place to go and nothing to do. You're just there. And it can feel like, very much like what that guy I pastored said, my world has stood still, is standing still. Time is definitely on your hands. Chuck Swindoll has said this: God not only plans the breadth of test, he plans the length as well. His timing is every bit as significant as his testing. He knows when you need the desert, and he knows when you are ready to move on. That's important for us to take note of. And during this time of having to be still, we know that God is giving us the opportunity to get to know Him better. Another thing that happens in our desert places is we are forced to have, for the most part, some solitude. The desert, wherever that may be for you, is a place where you can be alone with God. If you will, you can get to know Him better. If you will, you can get to know yourself better as well. Some of us like to avoid solitude because we don't like the company that comes with it, okay? The one person you can't get away from is yourself, my friends. Wherever you go, you are there. And sometimes God needs to get us in that desert place, in that place of solitude, not only so that we can get to know Him better, but so that we can do some self-reflecting and get to know ourselves better. And this is a good time to become more self-aware, to learn more about who you really are, and to take an honest look at yourself and say, okay, is this who I want to continue to be? Or are there some areas that God's showing me that I need to grow? Now take note of this, though. You can become more self-aware. That's a good thing during our desert times, but you don't want to become self-absorbed. There's a fine line between those two. Becoming self-aware means that you are just simply aware of your own feelings and emotions and desires, and also aware of how your feelings and emotions and desires are communicated to other people and the potential impact that you're having on other people. And when you become self-aware, you can become aware of good things about you that you need to continue to grow. You might become aware of some things that God wants to change. Another thing that we face in desert places is this. Not only is it obscurity and time on our hands and solitude, but oftentimes during the desert places that we find ourselves in, we have to deal with discomfort. God brings comfort to the afflicted, but He also tends to afflict those of us who have become too comfortable. V. Raymond Edmond was president of Wheaton College before his sudden death, and he wrote of a difficult time in his life that was his own personal desert. The experience brought him to this conclusion. He said these words, and let me quote, "I am here first by God's appointment, second in His keeping, third under His training, and fourth for His time." This gentleman had learned, maybe through the school of hard knocks, that being in the desert with the Lord is not as bad a place to be as we may think. We're here first by God's appointment. God saw to it that we end up here. Second, He's keeping us here for whatever time, and we are under His keeping. God's with us. Third, we're under His training. While we're there, there are things that we need to learn. And fourth, our desert places, as Mr. Edmund has aptly learned and communicated to us, is for His time. So if you find yourself in a desert place, I hope that you will take the time to do what the psalmist declared, to be still and know that God is God. So if we're in that desert place, what does God do for us there? What was God doing for Moses during this 40-year period of time? Well, we have Moses' own words to kind of reflect on, as recorded in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, verses 10 through 12. This is Moses looking back on this time in his life now and remembering the 40-year period of time that he spent under God's training in the desert. And he says these words in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 10 through 12. He found him in a desert land, and in the wasteland a howling wilderness. He encircled him, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on its wings. So the Lord alone led him, and there was no foreign God with him. Listen to these words, and from these words we can find a few things that God definitely did for Moses and he does for us when we're in our desert places. The first thing is this: he finds us. He knows exactly where we are. Even if we've run and we've hidden from God, you can't do that. God knows exactly where we are. He finds us there. He not only finds us, but according to these verses, he encircles us. He wraps us in his love and in his grace and in his mercy. And he also wraps us somewhat in his instruction, or rather in his correction. He finds us, he encircles us. He also instructs us. He shows us where we've done wrong. But in showing us where he does wrong, he also offers us how and where and when to do the right thing. God never just scolds us for doing wrong without giving us the instruction on what the right thing to do is at that time. He finds us, he encircles us, he instructs us. He also keeps us. The reference there, and also in Psalms, I believe it is, that he keeps us like the pupil of his eye. Let me tell you something. Our pupils are something that we need to take very good care of. And if something gets in them, man, we're going to do everything. It's just a natural reflex. If something's flying towards your face, especially coming towards your eyes, you're going to shut those eyelids quickly. You're going to turn. You're going to guard that pupil of your eye. That's what God does for us. And particularly when we are in those desert places, he keeps us like the pupil of his eye. He then goes on to lead us. God's not going to let us stay in that desert place any longer than we have to. And while we're there, he's going to lead us through the lessons that we need to learn there. But one of the things we need to do is to be patient enough and teachable enough to learn. He finds us, he encircles us, he instructs us, he keeps us, and he leads us. Now, why does all of this happen? If you go back to Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter, the 2nd verse, you find these words. You shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. The whole purpose of these desert places, my friends, is to test us and to grow us. Are we going to be faithful to the Lord our God? God allows these times. Maybe he allowed somebody else to get us in these times. Or maybe we just jumped right in these times ourselves because of our own poor decisions. But we have found ourselves like Moses on the backside of the desert, keeping sheep, if you will, doing some menial tasks. But during that time, God is seeing fit to meet us there. And he wants us to learn and to grow. He wants us to become more like him. He's humbling us and training us for other things. Now, it's interesting to note, if you think with me just a little bit ahead in the story of Moses' life, Moses will go on to eventually lead the Hebrews from Egyptian slavery. But before he can do that, he's got to learn how to lead himself the way God wants him to lead himself. And he's learning more about that by learning how to lead sheep. Now, I got to be honest with you, I have never dealt with sheep in my life. I've never been a shepherd of literal physical sheep, but everything that I've heard about that and everything that I've read about that says that sheep are ornery, they're stinky, they've got their own mind about them. They want to do what they want to do, and they've got to be led, and they've got to be taken care of. And I can tell you this, if a man can spend 40 years out in the wilderness learning how to take care of sheep, that might be some good training ground for something else that's about to happen. I believe that's what's going on in Moses' life. And I believe that's what is going on in your life and my life when we find ourselves in these desert places. So please take heart tonight, my friend. I don't want to minimize your struggle or your pain. If you are in a desert place right now, my heart goes out to you. And I hope and pray that you will make the most of this time to draw close to God, to know Him better, to know yourself better, to let the Lord work in and through you to prepare you for what He has next for you. Don't rush through this time. I know you don't want it to last any longer than it has to, and I get that. When I'm in those places, I don't want them to last any longer than I have to either. I was counting the days down for my 2-week quarantine to be over and couldn't wait to get on and about with other things. I get it. But I know this as well. If you will take the time to learn and to draw close to God in those desert places, you're going to be better for it. And those who are around you are going to be better for it as well. So take heart in that tonight. As we close out, I would ask you to keep this in mind as well. If you're not in a desert place right now, that's wonderful, that's great. But would you be mindful of those who might be? Would you be thinking about those whose world has stood still, while yours is just still turning 1,000 miles an hour or more, right? Would you take some time to step out of your busy world for a moment and check on somebody who might be hospitalized or in a nursing home? Or maybe they don't have any physical ailment, but they're just at a point of loss in life. They've lost a loved one, or they've been through a divorce, or they've lost a friendship, or maybe they've lost their job. Their world has all but stood still, my friend. I can assure you of that. Would you take a moment to pray for them? Would you take a moment maybe to just write a letter, send a note, send an email, send a text, make a call, or maybe even knock on their door and go spend a little time with them? You don't have to stop your world altogether, but would you just pause it for a few moments and give them some of your time? It would probably be good for them and for you. I hope you've received a blessing from this tonight. Thank you for your time and your attention. God bless you, and I look forward to picking this study up again next week. Have a good evening.